subtle discussions, you have to read fairly carefully. And even though Love's Confusions is not a scholarly book, it's not intended, just for university students or anything like that. Nonetheless, it's fairly dense and subtle. And I want to go through some parts of it, not all of it, but some parts of it to bring out some of the issues there. Oh, so let's go back to last time again. I'm not going to do any math, no. But rather to talk about ideas of closure and openness. They seem to me to be among the deepest kinds of questions. So, let's start with an obvious one. Once upon a time, the world was God's text, right? It was like the Bible, it was another text of God's that was here to satisfy a certain authorial purpose. We were put here for a reason, to fill out a story, and then the story would end and we would go either to heaven or hell. But the idea was the book had a fixed plot, and we had assigned roles in it, and there was a kind of end, right? History would end, this would all end, the end would be put out, and everybody would be assigned to their proper places. Now that's a form of closure, right? It says, you're living out a plot. You're in a play. You don't know what the play is, but you are in one, and somebody knows what it is. You've got a role, right? And that idea, which you find, for example, in Shakespeare, with all the world's a stage and all men and women merely players, that's a closure. And it opens. The closure opens. That closure opens when we realize or see that actually the world is Darwinian. That means that it's not going anywhere. There's no plot to Darwin. It's not as if there's an end point and everything's headed for there. And nobody knows. It's very hard to say exactly what will happen. It all depends on chance and necessity, adaptations to the circumstances. We appeared, but there's no guarantee we'll be around forever. We could be like the dinosaurs, right? We could, future beings on Earth, maybe yet smarter than we are, maybe they'll just be cockroaches, who knows? But whatever they are, they might, I suppose they were intelligent, they look back at us and they think, well, they were kind of cute, but they were murderous little devils, and eventually, they used up all the natural resources, they made the planet practically uninhabitable, and then they died out just like the dinosaurs, right? That's a possibility. Notice that says nothing really special about human beings. They just happen to arrive in the evolutionary scene. They might not be permanent parts of it. They might just disappear. Eventually, the universe will collapse into a black hole and leave not a rack behind, right? There won't be anything left of us, perhaps, of anything that there is in this universe. That's a completely different picture, right? There is a finish, but it's not an end in the sense of a plot. It's as if the whole thing just gets erased, right? It just gets wiped out. Different ones. So these are all well-known kinds of assaults on a common picture we had of ourselves. The other was, right, the universe was built around the Earth. The Earth was at the center. It was the stage. And everything was kind of looking at it, right? Like, well, look what's going on down there. That was the big TV screen in the universe, and everybody was watching to see. That's where the action was, right? It was there, and nowhere else. That was where God had pitched it, right? It's going to be staged there. Now, the idea that we're on just a rather insignificant planet and a not very exciting solar system among billions and billions of other such systems, kind of said, so what are we, not even cosmically special rather than that? No, we don't seem to be cosmically special either. But one last refuge of specialness has been the sort of idea, while we alone are self-conscious beings, for us, there's something that, matters. There's a way it is for us. Things don't just happen to us. We experience them with some understanding, see ourselves, see others. And that's an issue in philosophy and science hasn't been fully resolved. We don't yet see fully or clearly how it is that consciousness can emerge in the way that life did through Darwinian processes. Perhaps we will come to understand that, but as yet we don't have one. So that's one place, right? Different one, and that can be very exciting depending on how much content you put into the consciousness. A different one, though, and one that still remains very popular, is the idea that we're distinctive, and not just in being conscious, but in being rational. And reason is has been the last kind of bastion of a kind of picture of our specialness. And reason seems to present us, or seemed to present us right up until the end of the 19th century, with a kind of closure. Right? Reason was a closed system. So if we look at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, we see that God, the most perfect being, kind of looks at himself in a mirror, the mirror of his own self-consciousness, sees himself there, he just is the conscious awareness of that. And that's the best possible state to be in. Permanently, eternally, unchangeably in that state. Right? And that gives us a picture of, as I think, of a kind of frozen. Aristotle thinks that being is alive, but it's kind of alive, as he says, without change or movement, right? It's the activity, as he puts it, of motionlessness. It's as if there's something going on, but nothing is moving. That's perfection. And to the degree that we can approximate that state, right, as we might if we were in a kind of state of contemplation, right, that the mystics talk about, that's the best possible way to be. And it's closed, right? It's closed because it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't change. There's no... Now, reason seemed to be just like that. And in fact, there were lots and lots of attempts to show that it was like that. One was, you could prove that rational systems were consistent, complete, closed. You didn't escape them. You were locked into them. And these things that I mentioned, really just to hit you with a bunch of stuff to look at, not to articulate it all. Because we don't see this so much in the newspapers. We see all the other stuff. But most people don't know about these advances in mathematics, in part because, for reasons that are unclear to me, though math is probably one of the most exciting things going on in the world, it's not one that has a lot of sex appeal with ordinary readers, in part because it's too esoteric, even to get a handle on just what the issues are that are going on. And in math, the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century saw an explosion of ideas, and the net result of them was to open things up. So let's just take a couple that I mentioned. But infinity is closed, right? There's no outside of it. There's nothing bigger than infinity. Right? There's no outside of that. But what Cantor showed us? For every infinity, there's a big one. And there is no biggest. That was exciting, in part because he didn't just say that. He showed how to prove things about these different sizes of infinities, how to compare them, how to do math on them. That was exciting. But a different one altogether was the idea that somehow or other we could establish the consistency of our own beliefs, our own rational system. We could show that it was consistent, that there were no mistakes in it, no contradictions in it, that we could establish that we were obeying the law of non-contradiction. Right? We're never going to contradict ourselves. And what Gödel showed us, that even for a much simpler system, much simpler, just ordinary simple arithmetic with plus, minus, multiplication, and division, you could prove that you couldn't prove its consistency. You couldn't prove that you wouldn't run into contradictions by following the laws of arithmetic. That just was a blast to the pretensions of reason to be this kind of closed system. So that's what I wanted to get you to see, though. Right, all of these attempts to close, right, have in various ways failed. And that's an exciting thing. It's not something to bemoan. It's something to actually celebrate, right? It's something to celebrate because what it does is it tells us that no matter where we look, there's room for imagination, creativity, development, newness, novelty, growth, right? We're not locked in a box, right, where the answers are at the back of the book and we should just look them up at some point, right? Rather, we don't know. And so there is a kind of excitement of exploration and development. And that's the thought I wanted to put closer to our notions about love, because love can be represented as a kind of closure, right? You know, so two people looking at each other eternally, right? Or if you play out one of the other, looking at themselves eternally, right? Looking at themselves in the other, or each of them looking at God in the other, or each of them doing something else. And a different one is to think that, no, love is not the, however it begins, you know, with the blue foot or whatever that hooks you, right? It's what happens next. There's no reason to imagine that a successful love relationship as something that's scripted or closed. It's more like improvisational theater, so to speak, in which the couple work out something. And the idea is, well, what would allow you, what makes you good at improvisation? Not what makes you good at following a plot, right? So maybe I give you the how to have a good relationship book, right? And you look it up in a sort of 12 rules of a good, you see this in the newspaper, 12 rules of a good relationship. And you think, okay, rule number 1, right? You start following them, right? And you think, now we're having a good relationship. How do I know that? Well, we're following the rules for a good relationship. And there's something wrong with that, isn't there? I mean, there's something wrong with the idea that the goodness of a relationship could be scripted by the fact that you are following the rules. That won't seem to capture what it is. You won't be able to assure yourself that you are having a good relationship because you can think, look, I followed all the rules. Why won't that work? Why is it that, and I'll explain in a minute why I think, again, why it won't work. Okay, but that's the thought. Similarly, think, what's good sex? Well, get the Kama Sutra. Here are the 27 ways to have good sex. If you follow those ways, will you be having good sex? Well, not guaranteed, right? Why? Well, because what for you is going to be good sex depends on a whole set of variables, only some of which have to do with achieving orgasm or whatever. There's also the nature of the kind of engagement with the person you're having sex with, and that's the meeting of two particularities. It's not the meeting of two types, right? You're not like anybody else, only in some ways you're like them, but not in all ways. And the other person is not like everyone else either. It's two individuals meshing or fitting together to work out a drama for themselves that they're partly the authors of. And that's a new drama. It's not another version of an old one. Yeah.
So what does this like? So what does this picture say about something like the Ten Commandments?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I mean, it's how do we conceive of God? So one of the ways we could do it, right, is somebody who writes closed books, right? So God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. That's closure. Right? He's the perfectly infinite being. He's closed. He doesn't grow, develop, change, right? Why? He's perfect already. He's everything. He's all the omnis, right? He's right? He doesn't need anything else. But that makes it impossible to understand why he creates him. Right. I mean, so if he's like Aristotle's guy, thinks, well, the best of all possible things already exist. I mean, why would I make anything else? It would just be a falling away from perfection. No, when we get the Christian story about it, it's that God wants love. He wants to be loved by free beings. And that casts into question the way that we conceive of God. Even God becomes something open, right? So one of the ways, I'll give you some stuff to read about this later on, but here's just a quick view. God's love, the fact that God is, the Gospel of John says God is love, whatever that means exactly. Love is clearly sort of central to whatever we want to make of God. But love sets limits to knowledge. So if God is primarily a loving God, then that limits in a principled way is omniscience. Why? Well, think about respecting the privacy of the people that you love. So one of the ways we don't love another person is by violating their privacy, right? By, for example, reading their private letters or journals, by sticking our nose and looking at them when they're in the bathroom, doing things that they don't, violate their sense of their individuality, right? That's one of the worst things, violations of love, is to do something like that. Or, touching them when they don't want to be touched, treating them as if they're something of yours that you can do what you like with, and that their wishes, wants, and sensitivities don't matter. So if God were loving, that would set principled limits to his knowledge. There were things he couldn't do. He couldn't look into your mind to see what was going on there. Not because he's not able to do that, but because he's loving, he wants you to, so to speak, disclose things to him the way you want to. He doesn't want to force you to disclose. You can think of it that way. If you think of it that way, then the Ten Commandments are an attempt to articulate something, but just how we should understand them, right? How fixed they're supposed to be, how closed the system of them is. That might be thought to be part of what the New Testament adds to the so-called Old Testament. Right? I mean, if we're thinking about it religiously, which we don't have to, of course, but it's kind of useful sometimes to do that. So that would be the way I would say, even God is not, God also, as you might say, learning how to be a better God, right? Not fixed already and knowing everything already. Maybe the incarnation, the idea that God becomes a human, is in part an attempt to grasp that. To know what it's like to be a human is to give up in part on being a God, right? You don't know what it's like to suffer, to be vulnerable, to be frail, to be all those things, unless you try it on. But then trying it on is giving up on some of the other things that you once upon a time thought were godlike. Yeah.
Okay, so this is going to take me like a little bit to draw out, but so you've been talking about this idea of like a closed system, and to me it seems like if a system is not closed, what that sort of necessarily suggests is that there's this other thing that's outside of it that sort of threatens its like continuity and everything. But then earlier in the symposium, Diotima talks a lot about how love really concerns things that you don't have. And now we're talking about God, and it seems like a lot of people want to characterize God as love. And I guess I just wanted to sort of like bring up the fact that it seems really contradictory to think of a God who loves but also has everything.
I think that's right. And in fact, Plato draws the upsetting conclusion that God is not a philosopher, right? Because he doesn't love wisdom, right? Because he's got wisdom already, so why would he love it, right? You only love what you don't have. That seems to me to be an error in thinking about what desire is like, not, so there's something wrong with the very idea that what desire wants is to be filled, because that puts an end to it, kills it, and that seems like the wrong picture. So we have to, but notice that all these things press together, so if what you're thinking is the best of all possible things would be to be permanently satisfied, that's another form of closure, right? It's desire closure, so there's nothing more to want. But if what you're thinking is slightly differently, is that we don't know what there is to want, because we only have a limited access to it. Then we start wanting not to be locked into a cage of our actual wants, but for our wants to be able to grow in ways that puts us in touch with more and more and better goods, rather than limiting us to the ones there are. So we see that even in our own world, where we're constantly replacing one set of objects with another, a yet better and better iPhone. Right? That's one model. But I think that's the thought. We find comfort in closure, right? Because it's in a way it's a just so story. It's the kind of story we tell children, right? And they all live happily ever after. Once upon a time, right? But those stories aren't credible stories, right? They're mistaken. As far as we know, they don't fit us or our world. So what we have to do is think, well, how are we to think about these things we value if we don't think about them in a closed way? Yeah. So you're right. It puts pressure on every point. If you try to hold on to one, you end up closing around that one, right? And it doesn't matter which one you pick. You can pick a whole lot of different ones, and the story will end up being the same if you insist that something has got to be closed. So I want to say, we're very bad at thinking about this, but think about how important creativity, invention, imagination, these features of us, right, are immensely important. Yeah.
Well, I think it also reminds me of like Nozick's experience machine, and like because that one's like it uses like pleasure as a concept, but I think you can put it in different concepts.
Yeah.
And I think even like with reason, right?
Yeah.
Even if you're living in this like I think this Aristotelian like perfect view, I think a lot of people would not take that.
Yeah, the experience machine is a great example where you're offered, as much guarantee as you could possibly get, but you'll have all and only really pleasant experiences from now on if you get into the machine. And yet, where most people are reluctant to get into it, although they're not very sure why they're reluctant. But one of the reasons I think is that we know that that's a form of being dead. Actually, it's a form of not developing and growing and changing and finding new things. It's sort of saying, it's a bit like this. This is the best, so I'm going to hold on to this. But pleasure is not something that we should think of as itself, never changing. The pleasures that we get from new things are quite different from the ones that we got from old ones. Yeah, but you're right, that's another. There are many versions, right, of which we're operating on. Heaven, of course, is, right, one where, and I know, I think I've mentioned this before, I always think of it because the Talking Heads song about, heaven, everyone is trying to get to the bar, the name of the bar is called heaven, right, and in heaven, nothing ever happens. Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. The same thing goes on over and over again, and the thought is, you're supposed to like that. But everything we know about life, since Darwin, is that all living systems are evolving. There are no living, non-evolving systems. So you might think that of generalizing, if things are not evolving, they're not alive either. And that means there's no life in closure. Closure is a form of narcosis or a form of death in life, if you like, rather than a way of being fully alive. Yeah, you have a question.
Yes. Hold on, sorry.
Yeah.
This is kind of taking the open closedness in a literal form, and again, it will take me just a bit to lay out, but sociologically, I think the institution of marriage and relationships are kind of changing. So you're seeing a lot more polyamorous relationships now, or what we call open relationships. And I guess at first I was like, well, that's a way of fixing the closed problem. But then I thought there seems that in order for love, what love, actual love is, in order for it to exist, there has to be some kind of definiteness or closure. So even if you're in a relationship with 3 people, then it's a closed system between 3 people. Or
I think maybe you're taking, so it's not a way, you can think various ways about openness and closure, right? So, but one thought is, the limit on the number is though that's a form of definiteness, it needn't be a form of closure if the group together is open to all kinds of new possibilities. So creativity is not about the number of people involved, right? It's about what kind of life they have together. So you can imagine there's no, openness doesn't set any limit to the number of people, and setting a limit to the number doesn't automatically make for a closure. Right?
Sure, and that was just one kind of overly complex.
But I think a different. This may be where you were going, and I think this is right. You shouldn't think of closure and openness as sort of polar opposites, right? Or if you do, you shouldn't think that where we want to be is all the way on one side or all the way on the other. In a sense, you might think that what you want is to always have the possibility of kind of growing beyond or escaping, rather, or creatively moving onwards. So, and that's going to involve not everything being open all at once, because that's too much probably for us to handle, right? So we want, it's not so much that everything has to be open, everything has to be closed, but think of it this way: whenever we run into some aspect of our lives or relationships that are unsettling or disturbing, can we do anything about it? In a traditional marriage before divorce, there was very little you could do. You married the wrong person, you were unhappy and unsettled. That was it. Tough. Right? That was it. You made the thing, you signed the document, you made the promise, you're locked in. If we had many things in our lives that were like that, right, where even when we discovered that it was a mistake or there's something terrible about it or we want to get out of it, we can't, that's really bad. But there are lots of things that, on reflection, we don't want to get out of. And those are perfectly okay. There's no reason to sort of keep thinking, oh, I want openness on everything. No, if you really like this kind of music and these kinds of this kind of food and these kinds of clothes and these kind of, well, the openness or the part where you're innovating and need innovation is somewhere else in your life. The thought would be if you stagnate on any one of these things, then it becomes a problem. If you were locked in, no matter how much you want to get out, that would be a way of thinking about it. Yeah.
So, I guess this is kind of a slight change
Yeah.
of topic, but I was thinking about in Love's Confusions,
Yeah.
we talk a lot about like inner mommy and inner daddy and those
Yeah.
kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
About like your view of love forming
Yeah.
from your younger
Yeah.
self and
Yeah.
older self, and I was wondering how that plays into the idea of closed and openness in
Yeah.
love,
Yeah.
because I guess to me that makes it seem a lot more closed, a lot
Yeah.
more kind of
Yeah.
decided by certain factors. But I guess I wanted to hear
Yeah.
your thoughts.
So, so my thought there is something like this. You can end up, as a result of your childhood experiences, you can end up with kind of neurotic style of loving. You're never going to get satisfied if you keep doing that. And we often find ourselves in situations like that, where we don't understand fully the compulsion we feel to repeat errors, but we do them anyway. And let's suppose that's a result of our early upbringing. It's not always, but sometimes it is. I think the answer is that various kinds of psychotherapy can help us to become aware of the problems that we have and to some extent improve the way we deal with them. How much improvement depends on how serious the problem. And in some cases, all you can do is kind of learn to live with it. You can't actually. So I know it's like an illness. You're not going to get rid of it, but you can learn how to kind of curtail it a bit, keep it out of the main play. In other cases, you can actually learn to do better. So Freud famously says to one of his patients, I can't make you happy. I can't make you happy, but I can make you ordinarily unhappy. That is, not as disastrously unhappy as you are. I can decrease the level of your unhappiness. And that's sometimes the best we can do. There's no guarantee that, we can all be living in paradise. So that's a part of us that sometimes, if we're harmed enough in our childhood, we are locked into a box that we can't get out of. Just very little to be done about it, except make the box as comfortable as possible. We can't get out of it. There are tragedies in life. It's too bad, but there are. There's tragic situations about which very little can be done. And realism requires us to face up to that. We're not living in a dream. We're living in reality, and reality can be awful. Not much we can do about it sometimes. So, good. So let's back up now for a second and start. So we've been looking at, just this time, the first chapter of Love's Confusions, and I want to pick up just a couple of moments from it. Again, they're all consistent with the same story that we're telling, but the depth of the story is actually very considerable. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, please. Yeah. No.
Hung up on something.
Yeah. Go. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
And it kind of connects to what Michael said
Yeah.
about just like how we don't. Okay, it doesn't really make sense on the
Yeah.
view of human nature that we want to go to heaven because eternal pleasure is sort of death, and
Yeah.
you don't want to stagnate. And
Yeah.
so like, like let's say you go to therapy and you become not only like you not only become ordinarily unhappy,
Yeah.
like you become happy, and you think, or like in a relationship, like
Yeah.
you want satisfaction.
Yeah.
But like satisfaction is a sort of stagnation, I guess, and like apart from the fact that it could like breed complacency in your partner, and
Yeah.
that like he or she is satisfied, but
Yeah.
you're not like.
Yeah.
Aside from that, I'm just like super confused about like what a relationship is supposed to be if you're not like, if it doesn't make sense that we just pursue like things.
Well, I think that,
being peaceful.
think about it slightly different. Try to think about it slightly differently. So leave aside issues like satisfaction, which I think have more than one way we can understand them. But think about what it is to be in a relationship that's, fully alive, fully. You want more of it. You don't want less of it. Right? That's a sort of step towards something else, where, right, you don't think of, little emptinesses being filled by something, and then there's sort of a worry, oh, it's filled now, what am I going to do? But rather you think of it more like children's play. So the thought is, you play well together, and playing well together, you play the relationship game well together. And that game doesn't have rules like the game you played when you were kids, when you played house or played any one of those things. There's not a whole set of rules, right? You play it and you have fun playing it. And part of the fun you have is inventing what you're going to do. Now, of course, there's an awful lot of humdrum stuff in playing house, right? Somebody's got to clean the toilets and cook the food and do that other stuff, right? It's not all fun and games. But even these can be turned into forms of being alive together and so on, rather than into the dead thing. So there's an old idea that Christians had, that you could turn your whole day into prayer, right, by offering it to God. You don't get on your hands and knees and pray. Rather, whatever it is you're doing, you see it as a way of serving or acknowledging the reality of God. And you might think that relationships can be like that too, where what you're doing, so think of the difference between alienatedly, boredly cooking dinner because it's your duty and you have to do it, to thinking of the pleasure that's involved in feeding, nourishing, keeping alive, right, creating a scene for shared conversation, drinking wine together, talking to your children, doing lively, fun things and thinking about it that way. In a way, if you can keep thinking of more things that way, then the issue of your relationship won't be at the front of your mind at all, right? Any more than at the front of the mind of children playing house is. Is the game going to stop? Should we be worried about it? No, they're just too absorbed in it for that. And these don't raise, that kind of model doesn't raise the same sort of worries about stagnation, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would also say, kind of going off of that,
Yeah.
that even though in some cases we might consider a one-on-one
Yeah.
relationship a closed system, you're still interacting with other people outside that relationship, so you can bring all of these different
I agree.
things
Yeah.
because of the two different people that you are and the different experiences that you live every day. Like the
Yeah,
things
no,
that
I
you-
think that's right. And it can just be meeting other people. It can be meeting other valuable objects and things that you bring home. You can, bringing home the wage packet is just one model of all of the good things that you can bring. And the more of those things you have, the more, in fact, you're not thinking about your relationship, but together thinking about something and enjoying it, the more your relationship is going to be a success. When relationships run into problems, they start to become massively self-conscious. They're worried all the time. That's a form of anxiety about it, but in a good relationship has a very minimal role. You're not anxious. But look, there's another thing which we have to recognize, that even a really good relationship may have a kind of built-in time limit or a built-in power. So it's great for a while, or maybe even for a very long while, because the kinds of frictions and difficulties that are present for both parties, right, aren't dramatized. They don't have a kind of pertinent role to play until at a certain point they do. Maybe someone loses their job, or get sick, or the world changes in certain kinds of ways, or there are problems with children, and the relationship can't handle those. But it's handled everything up to now. But suddenly it's faced with things that it's not well suited to handle. We have to think too that a relationship is a dynamic entity that is part of a whole dynamic system, and the dynamic system can change and be the problem. War breaks out. It's not your fault. The relationship was fine until the guys with the Uzis, the machine guns, start showing up on the streets, and now there are a whole set of new pressures and tensions. But maybe the relationship can be what maybe it can't. Like the death of a child. Lots of relationships are unable to handle that, even though they've been able to handle a lot of other things. So we should think of it sort of a bit that way. So let me go back to the commandments for a second, because that's where love's confusion starts, right? It starts with these two great commandments, and it raises some questions about whether love can be commanded. But here's a thought that is, you'll see, related. So, remember at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, you have a perplexing bit as when Christ is on the cross. And he says, Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Right? It's a curiously human cry. So you might think, well, look, he knows. I mean, man, he's God, If you think of it that way. Nobody's forsaken anybody. I mean, this is a plot. I have to hang here for a while, then I die, then I go to hell or wherever I go for 3 days, then I come back. So, I know what's going on. No, the cry only makes sense if Christ on the cross is thinking what we would be thinking, right? That Daddy has abandoned us and we're left on our own devices. And so now roll that back into the commandments. This is the way Kant tries to, he's not thinking about the commandments, but he's thinking about the very same thing. So the commandments are moral laws, right? And the way Kant thinks about moral laws is this. He thinks this way. Look, they're the rules according to which the rational part, by its nature, acts. They're not, right, to it, they're not commandments. They're just like the laws of nature are for natural beings. It just operates according to them. You might think of the rational part as sort of like a computer working according to a program. It's not asking itself, does that program coercing me? Right? Is it making me do these things? Right? It's just operating according to them. But when reason talks to the other parts of us, to the natural parts of us, it talks in imperatives. Why? Because our natural parts are not set up by nature to obey those commandments, right? We don't just follow them necessarily, we sometimes break them. And so here's a way to think of it. What Christ represents to the Pharisees and the Sadducees as commandments, thou shalt, right, love thy neighbor as thyself, right, are only commandments when they're heard by creatures like us. They're not intrinsically commandments. They're laws of God's nature. That's the way to sort of think. So the reason I want to say this is that massive ingenuity over millennia has been brought to bear on these questions, feeling the same pressure points, right? Feeling like, how can we be commanded to love? How can we? It's something to do with our split nature, right? If we were gods, we would just love by nature, as God does, right? We wouldn't feel it like this, that there's an effort. It requires effort to love your neighbor, or you have to struggle at it, or sometimes you can't. You would just do it automatically as part of your nature, the way the thing falls. It doesn't decide to fall. It doesn't worry about falling. It doesn't sometimes not fall. It just falls. So that's one of the places where you can sort of feel, in subsequent developments in ethics, you can feel this little problem kind of reemerge as Kant struggles to articulate why it is the laws of reason appear to us as imperatives, but aren't imperatives for the rational part. So a way to kind of pull the two together. So really what we're being told is something like this. what you feel as an imperative is the law of your irrational nature speaking to your natural part. Your nature doesn't just follow the laws of love, but your rational part does. And when it speaks to you, therefore, it tells you imperatives. If you want to see this worked out, just read chapter 13 of book 1 of the Nicomachean. There you have reason talking to the other parts of the soul and issuing them imperatives when they aren't in harmony with the rational part of the soul. So if our natures were perfectly in harmony with our reason, they wouldn't feel the push, the struggle, the two laws in my members, and my sophus, and all that stuff. Okay, so there are ways to try to explain the nature of those commandments, right? Try to solve the problem of their imperatival nature, while at the same time wanting to recognize their role, right? So that's one line of thought about them. I don't think in the end it's very satisfying, because I don't find the idea of these two parts of ourselves with one set of laws particularly compelling either. But nonetheless, a lot of thought has been exercised trying to go there. Okay, so let's take a different line, which is the worry that especially Kant, but Kierkegaard has it too, stemming, same worry, different location, which is that when if I think about affective love, the kind of love that we think of as romantic for some people, but not for others. So I fall in love with one person, I'm in love with them, and I'm not in that kind of love with other people. That raises a series of problems, right? And they're all related. One of the problems is, well, how could you feel that kind of love for everyone? Right, because it seems to be selective. It seems to be triggered by certain kinds of things and not by others. The lady boobies only love the one with the blue foot, the right blue foot. They don't love all the other ones at all. Right, so we're a bit like that. Okay? And so it's selective. And then the other worry is that is that somehow or other it doesn't respect the freedom of the other person. You're seeing, Kant especially worries about this, you see them as a means to your end, as a way of satisfying your own sexual desires, for example. Not as, a free and autonomous being. There's something Kant finds, suspect about the very idea of this kind of compulsion towards another person, right, that sexual attraction is, that also seeks a kind of pleasure for itself. And he thinks there's something wrong with that. And as you remember, he tries to solve it by thinking about marriage as a way to get out of that thought that in sexual relations, each one is using the other as a way of getting pleasure for itself. And so that the interest we have in another person as a sexual object becomes an objectifying or diminishing interest. And that's a worry that has continued to eat away at ideas about sex. So let me give an example. I mean, do you know who Catherine MacKinnon is? Catherine MacKinnon is a radical lawyer, feminist lawyer, who argues really that all sexual relations are objectifying. They're all bad. They're all bad because they all embody a certain kind of patriarchal power structure. There's no possibility of having sexual relations that are somehow or other free of that way in which women are dominated and men aren't. So sexuality comes with a political structure to it that is instantly demeaning for, or diminishing for, or objectifying of, especially the women. And so the thought is, so you hear things like all sexual relations are rape. That's dramatic claims of this sort. And here's the thought, though, it's not stupid. It sounds extreme. But think about it this way. So under what conditions can you consent? So we have big worries about this on date rape and other considerations. What is it to consent? What is it to say okay and then it is okay? Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
a huge fan of Catherine McKinnon, and I've been waiting to bring this up
Yeah.
for the entire semester,
Yeah.
so I'm really glad we're getting here. But
Yeah. Yeah. Everything comes to him who waits or her who waits
Right.
too. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think she's misquoted as saying that
Yeah.
in situations of radical inequality, meaningful consent cannot be given. I don't think she actually said that, but that's basically the
Yeah.
idea that you're saying.
Yeah.
There's something- And I wanted to bring this up also. I was thinking about it with the God thing.
Yeah.
That if God really loves us, and
Yeah.
as you said, that imposes certain limits on respecting the privacy and
Yeah, yeah.
autonomy of other individuals.
Yeah.
And God is so obviously perfect superior
Yeah.
being to
Yeah.
us lowly mortals. Then how can, if taking the McKinnon approach, true loving,
Yeah.
consensual
Yeah.
sexual relationships cannot exist between men and women,
Yeah.
how could they exist between humans and God?
Yeah. Well, so there's a way to extend the problem that McKinnon raises. And the way I put the problem that you raise is something like this. When we ask about consent, right, can you consent meaningfully to sexual relations? We have to consider the circumstances in which the way you're formed, the power structure, makes your consent meaningful. So take the obvious one, right? So we all know there's something wrong with this. Your boss, on whom your livelihood depends, suggests that maybe it'd be good if you had sex with him, right? And now you're not just thinking this, well, gee, that's fine because I'd like to have sex with him, or no, I don't want to, right? That would be, right, the way we'd like it to be, so to speak, that you do it if you want to and you don't do it if you don't want to. That would be the first pass. But in this case, you think, gee, if I say no, maybe he'll fire me. And if he fires me, then I won't be able to pay the mortgage and the kids won't go to school. And that starts running through your head. Now what McKinnon thinks is, your consent is constrained in ways that we don't want consent to be. Right? You should be consenting to this. You shouldn't be, right, making worries about the rest of your life. And that's the first step. The first step is to think that you should be saying yes to this, not yes to it because of a whole lot of other considerations. But now there's another one, right, which is the very desire that you have, right? So I said, well, if you want to, and you say yes, that's good, and if you don't want to, and you say no, that's good. But how did your desires get formed? So part of the thought is, by being brought up a woman or a man, your desire structure from the beginning is already contaminated by a power structure that exists in the world. Male domination, right, is reflected in part in how little girls and little boys are brought up, right? So even when a little girl confronts her desires, or a grown woman now, who used to be a little girl, confronts her desires and thinks, yes, I will have sex with you, right, I want to. We have to ask whether that want is one, so to speak, she would have had she been brought up in a non-patriarchal, dominant society. Now you can see how hard it starts to get to backtrack into what would be good circumstances for forming desires. Yeah.
Yeah, I think an interesting take on this has been put by Slavoj Žižek, a modern pop
Yeah.
philosopher
Yeah.
who loves
Yeah.
to talk about, but he puts it very well, and he
Yeah.
is that picking up on Foucault and Lacan,
Yeah.
that sex is always a power dynamic,
Yeah.
and same kind of strain as McKinnon. McKinnon's more of a modern version of it.
Yeah.
But what Žižek says essentially is that modern culture, contemporary, especially neoliberal culture,
Yeah.
has tried to kind of make everything, in the creation of consent culture, which is not bad.
Yeah.
There is the kind of harmful aspect of seeing sex as something that is not a seduction,
Yeah.
which in every case it is.
Yeah.
Because even if you are simply asking someone,
Yeah.
do you want to have sex,
Yeah.
that is a seduction, even if
That is a
seduction
Uh-huh.
at its base level.
Yeah.
So that's the point, I guess, that's the thought.
notice that so first we've got a question of formation, and then there's, of course, the inevitable sets of dynamics that there are, even at the base we do as well as we can. So let's imagine, for example, that the power structure, the patriarchy, doesn't exist, and that we have no reason to question the formation of our desires as having been not made in the best circumstances. We think, oh no, these are good, everything was fine. But there is now a further question, right, of now two people who don't have to worry at the beginning of this, right, oh, you know, I'm not sure these desires are mine. So you can think this in Blade Runner, where, right at the moment where I don't know whether these desires are mine or they're, you know, so-and-so's niece's desires, right? Or because I don't know where I got my memories from. That's dramatizing it. But suppose there are no worries like that. You're pretty confident, and you're right. These desires are yours, as much as any desires can be anybody's. And they aren't distorted by power imbalances. Now there's a new one, right, which is the facts of relationship and the way in which your desires can be shaped, changed by seduction, by other things, right? And now we have that's a different but related problem, which is, right, in what way do we think it's okay for us to interact with one another, even if we already have formed desires? Well, some of the ways we know we are allowed to do, right? So I know what your desires are, but I'm going to bamboozle you into thinking that I will satisfy them. I can lie to you, for example. So we know there's something wrong with those. But I think the first place we want to look at is this question of what is meaningful consent if there is a power imbalance that shapes the formation of desires in such a way that even when you do what you want, you're being already coerced, right? Because the desires that you have are not ones you would have had you been brought up in the best kind of society. That's why, right, McKinnon can say something like this, that all sex is rape. Why? Because there is no meaningful consent if there is this power imbalance. I'm not saying she's right. I'm saying that's a way to get the picture of what worries her. Yeah.
So how is then the inequality of sexes and domination of one sex over another is different from master-slave relationship, which Marx explores?
Yeah. That's one. That's one of those.
Yeah, no, that's...
So it's not another way to present this would just be to say that male hegemony is just another example of a master-slave relationship. That is to say, once you've got a power imbalance or dominance, whatever it is, so one of the ways that male dominance is reflected in society is by economic dominance. So just look at the pay scales for men and women, right? And you see immediately that those don't cash out in terms of equal pay for equal work. Well, that has immediate consequences if, for example, a marriage breaks up. So when marriages break up, most males do better. But within a year or two, they're doing better than they were when they were married. Most women are doing less well. And there are lots of reasons for that, about enforcement of child support, all kinds of things that are in the background that say it's disadvantageous to a woman to get a divorce. Even if she really wants one, it's economically disadvantageous. She will immediately fall into a lower economic class. That now affects her question, whether do I want to get a divorce or not? The husband doesn't have to worry about that. He thinks, I'll be in a better economic class. So you may have other worries, but that's not going to be one of them. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand like what McKinnon's getting at. So it's what it kind of reminds me of is like John Rawls' like veil of ignorance.
Yeah.
Is that like if it were like if we're all behind this veil of ignorance, like the woman wouldn't choose.
I think
the world we're in right now. It'd be something completely different.
I think the thought would be, so think about it this way. Try to think, how would I like to have been brought up so that, right, as a result of my upbringing, my chances of doing as well in life, being as happy and so on as possible in the world that I'm in, or in the world that itself would be the result of everybody being brought up that way. What would that be like? And we can, Rawls's attempt with the veil of ignorance is to sort of get us to reflect a little bit on what kind of a world we would all choose if we were thinking that way, and that's a good way to do it. I think that Yeah, go ahead.
No, continue.
That was just a thought. So
Yeah.
a thought would be, think about, I'm tempted to write on that board, but, think about so suppose that the best shape, just to think about kind of geometrically, the best shape for our desire structure would be a circle. So if our desires were circular, right, so to speak, that would be the best. But in fact, they're kind of this shape. And we want to try to get from here to there. Right, so we're thinking politically about what our desire structure, et cetera, would be. We can do this psychoanalytically, right? You were raising the question about what it's like right when we're small children. What are the good kind of families to be brought up? What do families have to be like so that their children end up closer to the circle than they end up closer to the splotch, right? And when we're doing that, we're reflecting or trying to reflect on the fact that our desires don't come from nowhere, and that some desire structures are themselves going to exploit us. They're going to be bad for us to have, even though we can certainly act on them. Right? So bad for us to act on them, but there you are. We've got them. What we should, this is articulating the position, what we should say in response to it is a different question.
Yeah, I was just thinking
Yeah.
about how we're all sort of talking about I guess sort of we're all sort of operating under an assumption of a choice model of autonomy that works best, but maybe the choice model of thinking about women's autonomy doesn't actually work. And so I just sort of want to press on that.
Good.
Yeah.
And what would you think you would put instead of it?
No, I know. I mean, that's a hard question.
Well, I think that so there are two ways you can look at the choice question too. So think about going to the supermarket to buy some washing powder, what do we call it, laundry soap. Right, and you detergent, thanks, yeah. You go to the supermarket to buy detergent, you can tell I do this a lot. And you go to the detergent aisle, and there are 8,000 detergents, all claiming to be the very one you need, right? And the question is which one do we buy? So one thought is, what are the objects made available for choice? And the other is, how were your choices, how were your desires shaped? So it might well be that what we want to think is not just about one side of that problem, but about both sides, right? So so part of the thought is your freedom can be overwhelmed by too many options. And that's, in fact, one of the ways you get exploited. Right? One of the ways you're exploited is your decision-making is overwhelmed by the options. And then you're going to respond to noise. You're going to think, oh, I like the blue one. Or you'll remember some jingle that you heard in your head and you'll go for that one. But your capacity to actually make rational discriminations is being overwhelmed by the number of choices available. I'm sure you've all experienced this. Try buying a pair of jeans, right? Or even going to get a coffee in Starbucks. These are like there are too many. I just want a coffee. No, we don't have that. We've got no. You can't just buy a pair of jeans. You have to buy low rise, high rise, skinny, thin, and you can't even tell what the hell the difference is between these things. Right? So that's a way of being overwhelmed. So we might think. I'm just tracking your thought. We might think that we have to look at two aspects of our freedom in thinking about designing the world where we'll do best. One is about our own limited rational capacities to make discriminations, and then say, those shouldn't be overwhelmed by the number of things there are. That's still staying with the choice model, but it's modifying it slightly by saying, well, some things shouldn't be, some ways in which our choices can be overwhelmed shouldn't be part of the picture. I don't have one thought you could have, and maybe this is what you were sort of lurking in the background. It's not obvious at all, and so we shouldn't accept it. It's not obvious at all that the best way to think about our freedom is in terms of our choices. It might be better to think of it in terms of our choice formation. That's to back away from what our actual choices are, our actual desires are, to how should how should a motivational self be shaped in the first place, right? That's not a choice model, because you're not appealing to actual choices. You're looking rather at different considerations. So one might be this: well, you want your choice structure to reflect the actually valuable things that there are in the world to access. This would be to move away from in here to what there is out there, and then to think that what I want to be is responsive to genuinely valuable things, where the genuinely valuable things are not constructed simply in terms of what people choose. So that would be a move towards a different yeah.
I think it's really what Gavin said. It's just, and like also
Yeah.
McKinnon, I don't know,
Yeah.
pulling together a couple
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
So like if, where to start? I feel incoherent in this class always.
Yeah.
So like, all right, baseline. So we're like responsive.
Coherence is not always the best thing, you know. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's a
Right.
bit closed.
If we're like
Yeah.
responsive, adaptive creatures
Yeah.
in virtue of our animal nature,
Yeah.
we're always going to be responding to our environments.
Yeah.
And I am totally in agreement
Yeah.
with McKinnon that, like, for women especially, the current environment isn't the best one to
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
free, healthy choices. And you said it's
Yeah.
not obvious that our freedom should be thought of in terms of choices, which is cool, but set
Yeah.
aside for a second. It's
Yeah.
just like I was thinking of two different scenarios when one of our first conversations was
Yeah.
about how in ancient Greece,
Yeah.
sexual norms are
Yeah.
so different that kind of
Yeah.
like, regardless of whether you're a straight or gay
Yeah.
or something
Yeah.
else man,
Yeah.
like you're going to be in relationships with both men and women.
Yeah.
Or I was thinking of like the beginning of Wonder Woman
Yeah.
and just like there are a bunch of women on an island. So
Yeah.
it seems like no matter what kind
Yeah.
of situation it is, like it can't be thought of in terms of like a best case scenario for humans or women or whatever
Yeah.
to like make their most authentic and well-informed decisions.
I don't think that the conclusion follows from the premises. Because I think that, because part of the thought you might have is a whole lot of different kinds of situations, including the ones you described, could be good ones in which to form your desire set. The issue about whether they are or not depends a lot on the level of coercion, distortion. I mean, so it matters a lot, for example, for whether or not if you form your desire set in that way, a worthwhile life will be accessible to you. If you live out those desires in this world, will the life be, roughly speaking, a pretty good one for you to have? And so you'll pretty much like it, and you'll think it's worth living and meaningful, and there'll be a certain level of satisfaction and happiness and all those other things, and you'll be in touch with really valuable things. There might be lots of different lives like that. I mean, different political systems, all of which, though they look superficial,